Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we start out with the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, where they've managed to capture an additional 131 square kilometers by Sudzha and an additional 8 square kilometers in the north. This totals the Ukrainian gains in the Kursk region to approximately 300 square kilometers, 100 square kilometers more than the Russians have captured in the Kharkiv region, and this is only the second day of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. The Ukrainians have managed to reach the outskirts of Sudzha and captured some of the villages ahead of the village. We see that there are river lines near Sudzha where the Russians are trying to stop the Ukrainian offensive. Heavy fighting is taking place within the town itself and the surrounding villages. We see that there's a series of villages connected to the same area right here, and the Russians are attempting to have that as a defensive position where they are trying to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing their own positions within this area. They are establishing this village chain as their defensive line against the Ukrainian offensive. They've already lost the fortifications ahead of this village agglomeration, and the Ukrainians are pushing and hitting the Russians hard. However, the fighting over Sudzha itself has only just begun. The first footage that comes from the village shows heavy destruction in the village itself of Sudzha. There are civilians walking around, and there's just destruction everywhere from the shelling. The Ukrainians are heavily shelling the town before entering it. Then we see this second photo from a UAV that shows Ukrainian vehicles at the very entrance to Sudzha. There is a tank and an armored personnel carrier by the entrance of it. So we see that the Ukrainians have reached the entrance of Sudzha, but no actual fighting is taking place within it yet, as the Ukrainians stopped at the entrance. The reason for this is that the Ukrainians have decided to keep this offensive going. And the way they're doing that is that they have two groups in their offensive. They have the assault forces, and then they have the actual fighting force. The assault force are the ones who are going to continue advancing into Russian territory and capture more of it, while the actual fighting force is going to be consolidating the gains. So we see that the Ukrainians have pushed about 10 kilometers deep into Russian territory. That needs to be consolidated before they can actually move further. So they have two groups, one that is going to push further despite it not being consolidated, while a second group at the same time consolidates it. So we're going to see multiple waves of the Ukrainian forces pushing through, as the first wave will continue pushing beyond the front line, and the second wave will consolidate the gains behind them. We'll likely see additional pushes towards Koronevo here to the northwest, and we'll likely see a push beyond that of Sudzha before the area is actually taken control of by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will likely go around it, either by going in the northern direction on the eastern bank of the river line and along the railways, or flanking the Russian positions from the south, where we have seen a significant push by the Ukrainians today. We've seen that the Ukrainians have captured the villages here in the southern flank of Sudzha. There is a small river line that they have to cross over, but if they pass through this march area, they'll be able to flank Sudzha from the south and move on beyond it. But it is likely to be in this northern direction because the terrain is much better to pass through than the southern parts. They may get stuck in the south, and it will be difficult for them to push onwards, but in the northern flank they have a much better potential, and will likely not move in a northern direction, but use the northern flank to go beyond Sudzha and flank it to then move onwards along the highway. The highway is connected to Kursk, so it would be a move directly towards Kursk. The objective of this offensive by the Ukrainians is still not clear. All we know so far is that according to Russian sources, on the very first day, the very first hours, they originally believed 300 Ukrainian soldiers and about 30 armored vehicles entered Russia, and they started operations like that. But it turns out, according to the updated information, that the Ukrainians actually entered with 1,000 soldiers and about 100 vehicles. This is 3 times as much as the Russians first thought, and this is why the Russians did not manage to accurately respond to the Ukrainian offensive, which then led to the Ukrainians taking this much territory. Following that, according to the latest reports, there are now 2 brigades of the Ukrainian side inside Russia, and 2 additional brigades being sent to reinforce to become the force that will consolidate their gains, while the first 2 brigades will continue pushing. And then there's an additional 8 brigades in reserve that are waiting to be sent to this front. They are behind the shooting range of Russian long-range strikes to prevent casualties ahead of them being sent to the front. So we have 12 Ukrainian brigades dedicated to this offensive, according to the latest news from the Russian side. There has been no speech at all, there's been no information at all from the Ukrainian side about this offensive. This is why the Western media is hardly even talking about it, because they were just as surprised as anyone else. Ukraine has realized if they don't really talk about the offensive, no one really knows about it. However, I did predict this offensive. I didn't know where it would happen, but I did know that it would happen as soon as the Ukrainians got the F-16, and this has happened. The Ukrainians got the F-16, and now they are launching the offensive. I think initially the Ukrainians were just testing the waters, seeing how strong the Russian defenses are in the area and exactly what sort of situation there is. Seeing that the Russians were weak in the area, they took advantage of it and have developed it further. And considering the current success of the Ukrainians, they're likely going to fully dedicate and double down on it to launch a proper offensive. And that is exactly what we're seeing the initial stages of. The Ukrainian advance here in the north is confirmed with this geolocated footage here, confirming the Ukrainian presence in the north, and this is the 3rd piece of geolocated footage here in the northern section. Then we have 1 piece here in Sudzha, and that is what we have seen confirmed by footage. The other advances were confirmed by reports from Russian soldiers. In addition to that, we also have this footage here, this picture showing Ukrainian vehicles, retrieval vehicles, to retrieve some of the damaged equipment that they lost along the way. The Russians are heavily striking the Ukrainian offensive, but they do not have the necessary manpower to stop it or halt it right now. This is why the Ukrainians are able to fully retrieve some of the equipment, but they will still be doing that under fire. But this again shows that this is a proper offensive. They have all the different types of vehicles, retrieval units, mine clearing units, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, everything that they need. This is why the Ukrainian front line has been struggling for so long. Despite the additional aid coming in, they reserved all of it for the reserve units, and this is why, while everyone was expecting that these reserve units wouldn't really be fully equipped, because they would be sending the equipment to the front line, but they were still lacking. This just shows that the Ukrainians didn't prioritize the front line, but instead prioritized this reserve, which then allowed them to make such a powerful strike. But this also means that they bet everything on this assault. There's also come more footage of POWs that the Ukrainians have taken from the Russian side. The most recent pictures shows approximately 36 POWs. This means that the Ukrainian number of captives they have taken from the Russian side numbers somewhere near 100 at this point. About half of those are conscripts and the other half are standard Russian soldiers. So this kind of speaks to the concentration of Russian forces in the area. It's pretty much 50-50 between conscripts and Russian soldiers. It is likely that that will significantly change the deeper they go in, that it will be less conscripts and more main Russian soldiers, as the Russians will rotate their main forces that were in reserve in the Belgorod region toward the Kursk area, where they'll then be fighting the Ukrainian offensive. The Ukrainian offensive is well organized, and we see some of the footage from the first day where the Ukrainians were entering. We see that the tanks have the nets to cover for the drones. They have infantry fighting vehicles, they have tanks, they have the same markings as the Russians were using. They also have like all of the engineering units and vehicles that they were needed. They have sold both vehicles without infantry and they have vehicles with a lot of infantry even on top. So we're seeing that they're pretty much doing what the Russians are doing. The difference is one thing that I've always criticized the Russians for is that they're too casualty averse. They haven't been launching any offensive operations similar to this since the very start of the war, yet the Ukrainians have done so multiple times, both with the Kharkiv offensive and now again, showing that it is still possible, it is still doable, although the Russians don't believe that it is without taking heavy casualties. So far the Ukrainians have advanced this much with fewer soldiers than the Russians even were using in the Kharkiv direction. So we see that the high mobility warfare is still plausible and is still doable. The Russians are just not doing it. This shows that the Ukrainians are doing exactly what I've been advocating for either sides do in this war if they want to actually capture some territory. As we see, it has been successful, and the way to do it is simply to not be afraid. If you're not afraid of fighting, if you're not afraid of going in, that is when you actually advance. Sometimes the Russians in small numbers have done very ballsy things, like rushing into the village of Sokil here in the Avdiivka section of the front line, the Pokrovsk section of the front line, when infantry fighting vehicle actually entered by itself, and from that they actually managed to capture the village of Sokil within a few days, and this proves my point exactly. So we're seeing that the Ukrainians continue with these offensive operations, and they're seeing success with them again. According to the latest reports, Ukraine did not give any US advance notification that they were going into Kursk, as per 2 US officials according to the Wall Street Journal. So this shows that this is something that they planned on their own and are executing on their own without consulting anyone. According to the latest reports, the Ukrainians are sending reinforcements to the Kursk region, so are the Russians. They're sending reinforcements. We are likely going to see massive battles taking place in the Kursk region, and this could be the Battle of the Bulge for the Ukrainians. We see that war is very fluent, anything can happen, and the way that the Ukrainians have been fighting for the past half a year is to pretty much sacrifice their soldiers, manpower, and people in the east to prepare for this offensive in the north, and they're hoping that this is something that can either turn the tide or generally just improve the position of the Ukrainians across the front. They're betting everything on this offensive, so we are likely going to have to expect that this is something where the Ukrainians are going to go all out in. They're going all or nothing with this offensive, is my opinion. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.